you. Thanks for tuning into the Waiting List podcast. I'm Long Long.
I'm Daniel.
And I'm Jacqueline. And we are three watch friends with a healthy obsession for watches.
So sit back and relax with us while we chat with collectors, industry giants, and share some good vibes. Today we have a man who you may not have heard of, but you would have definitely have heard of his platform, which is none other than A Collected Man, aka ACM. By the way, I just love that name, by the way. I don't know where you came up with that. I just think it's such a great name, and how your brand actually fits into that. It's just like just such a smooth transition. We're going to get into that later. But anyway, his name is Silas Walton, and it's actually the first ever Silas I've ever met or known, actually. Like the first ever Silas I think I came across was in Da Vinci's Code. But you're the first ever Silas. And that Silas, by the way, in Da Vinci's Code used to whip himself. But
yes, yeah, the self-flagellating monk. I've heard of that.
Yeah. Inspired by him.
Yeah. So it's quite a rare name, isn't it, Silas? Have you ever come across somebody also called Silas?
I think it wasn't until I was about 10 I came across another kid that was called Silas, but yeah, relatively uncommon.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, come to think of it.
Yeah.
Have you ever come across anyone called Long Long?
In Hong Kong, you'd be surprised.
Right. Yeah. Is it because you keep looking in the mirror?
Dude, I so knew that was good. All right.
Anyway, let's get this interview underway. And I think Jack has the floor for the first question to kick us off.
Right. Okay. So welcome onto the show, Silas. It's always nice talking to you on Instagram. And my first question for you is, obviously, like, your background wasn't in watches. And so what was the origin story that motivated you into starting A Collected Man?
Well, thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to join you. What was the origin story that got me into A Collected Man? So yeah, I went to law school. Then I went to business school. As part of my business masters, I did an internship in a private equity fund here in London. I moved from Paris back to London. And I was in something called deal origination, which basically meant trying to find interesting potential companies for leverage buyouts or management buyouts. So every day I was reading new business plans and meeting new potential, entrepreneurs, let's say. And so my head was geared very much at the time towards looking at opportunities and trying to kind of figure out if, there were any around me. I knew that I didn't want to work probably in a large structure or a large company. I was looking at venture capital maybe, or management consultancy like a lot of my friends. But I just happened to kind of need to sell a watch or two, and I knew nothing about it. I liked watches like everybody else, but I didn't know anything about the space, and I just had a really bad experience. It was through eBay. Then it was the high street, talking to kind of dealers. It was a complete and total, novel experience for me. And I just I found it strange that it was so painful, either economically or simply as an experience. And so one thing led to another. I had this idea that maybe there would be some kind of gap where you make it more painless and more lifestyle orientated. I liked photography. I liked visuals. Pitched an idea to someone I knew who was a big independent watch collector. Complete luck that I happened to know that person. In fact, I had no idea they're a watch collector, and I'd known them for 10, 15 years. And then it transpired that they were. That person said no, but introduced me to somebody who said yes. And then that person who said no changed their mind 24 hours later and said yes. And then basically there was originally an idea around an auction platform, but it didn't make sense at the time. And subsequently, within 6 to 12 months, we'd moved from kind of mid-tier to sort of gravitating towards the rarer end and the independent end, where there just seemed to be no real presence other than Steve Hallock in California, who was kind of solely representing the pre-owned independent space, very ably. And so we had this platform called Watch Exchange for a couple of years, and I wanted to change the name almost as soon as I stopped the company. but I just figured I had to kind of like get my feet under the table first and figure out if this would work. And yeah, that was how it then swapped to A Collected Man.
Yeah, so like Watch Exchange sounds like a name that you spent a weekend to think about. No offense, right? Like it sounds like, you start up and you come up with a name. I need to get this going. What are we doing? Oh, we're exchanging watches, Watch Exchange. Let's be kind of clever and drop the E and just keep an X, right? Like
very good.
Very, very clever, can't see that one. How
well, yeah,
I'm sorry, the sarcasm is just going to come out because you're British and so am I, right? So
that's absolutely fine. Be my guest.
How did you come up with The Collected Man? Did you come up with that yourself, or did you outsource that to like an agency?
No, I came up with it. I remember I had a very talented colleague who I'm sure many of you know now as Sean Song. Sean Song worked with me for a couple of years in the beginning. And I remember going for coffees and saying to him, look, I want a new name. And obviously there were lots of limitations. Is the .com available? I didn't want to have I had watchexchange.london, that's how much thought I put into it back in the day, because I couldn't have watchexchange.com. And so I remember we talked a lot and there were lots of interesting ideas, and Sean pitched some as well that were good, very good even, I think. But it didn't work for one reason or another, because of the .com wasn't available. We had one idea that technically we still own the IP rights to, so I should probably keep it under my hat. But essentially the lawyers after 3 months said, look, you just can't go with this. You'll be sued by a major German company that has sued everyone since the dawn of time that includes that word, one of those words in your name. And so I just remember at one point, exhausted, I think I was sitting on the terrace of the hospital club in Covent Garden, and it was sunny. I had about 3 coffees, and I think Sean and I had been talking for an hour or two, and I just somehow I figured that I knew I wanted a phrase. I knew I wanted it to be a phrase, not really like Watch Exchange or something like that. So I wanted at least 3 words. I wanted it to reference some kind of lifestyle aspect, and I loved the idea of Collected being a sort of double entendre, in the sense that it was, somebody who collects, but also someone who's collected in their thinking. At the time, to be completely transparent, the man reference was simply just to kind of like, it was almost like just pointing to the elephant in the room, which was 99% of our clients at the time were men, especially when we were smaller and we just had less exposure, right? And so
are you saying that because there's 2 girls here?
I'm saying that. I'm saying it because I think it was just kind of like part of the thinking process. And so yeah, basically, and I liked the idea of no one has ever noticed or commented since forever, but basically the O in A Collected Man, the way it's kind of like at an angle, was basically inspired by the 0 on 10 Downing Street. And I wanted, if I could at all, I wanted some reference to the fact that we're British and based in London. And no one has ever commented on it or got it. So clearly it was a success, but I liked the idea of having some kind of nod. So
hey, Silas, I've noticed that the O in Collected Man is actually very similar to the one in Downing Street.
Very observant, Daniel. No one's ever said that before. You're the first person.
But just going back to something you said earlier, right, which was your selling experience was very poor. Did you guys not have Watchfinder at that time?
Watchfinder in what sense? Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And Watchfinder was probably, so when I was doing my business plan, I must have collected and read and dissected every single interview, piece of press, or kind of commentary on Watchfinder going back all the way to its inception. I'd accumulated all the data points and where it had started, the average transaction value when it started, where it was today. So Watchfinder was always the kind of inspiration for the kind of like business, the operational concept, but not the inspiration for anything that was kind of lifestyle. Mr. Porter was very much like my bag. And there were a few other platforms that inspired me from what I did in Paris. So I would say that if I was to lazily say where we kind of crossed, I would say it was somewhere between Mr. Porter and Watchfinder. So the service and hopefully the efficiency of Watchfinder, but with the kind of subtlety of Mr. Porter if possible.
Yeah.
I have a question about the initial investment. So the initial seed money was about £50,000, right? How did you come up with that figure? Was it based on what the investor was comfortable with, or was there some kind of calculation where you evaluated your business and then you thought it was going to be the size?
So no, I would love to say that it was very engineered and considered, having done corporate finance and lots of modeling at business school. But the reality was that I definitely was what you might call a cautious entrepreneur. So my father was a self-made man. So I came, I grew up in a household where, I was, business was a topic of frequent conversation. But I basically, having come from law school, which was very conservative, and worked in law and then done these other things, I had a naturally quite conservative and cautious streak. And so I figured what I would do is I wanted to start this company. I was absolutely prepared to put everything else on the back burner, quit interviews, not apply for jobs, risk the kind of like the ridicule of my friends who all kind of put a hand over my shoulder at parties and said, what's going on? Why are you not throwing yourself into a career? But I also knew that I needed other people around me who could balance out a lot of the gaps that I had, right? I didn't know, I had no experience. I'd never started a business before really in my life. I knew nothing about the watch industry other than my research over months and months and months that created the business plan. I didn't know, as one of my investors pointed out to me in one of our first meetings, what a 40 millimeter case diameter meant, or what it meant when he said it was an 18 by 16 lug to kind of buckle with. I didn't know any of those technical things. I'm not sure I even knew how a watch really functioned, other than the basics. But I was lucky to surround myself with people with watch expertise, people with business expertise, and just a few people, friends and family, who kind of kept me on a level. And so I basically figured out that I would cough up £15,000, which I had at the time to kind of put into it. As with like many of these stories, I convinced my dad to cough up the same amount. I said, look, if you'll match me, I'll put it in. And then we convinced the gentleman that I mentioned to you, who was a watch collector, to do the same. And then there was a little bit of extra capital from someone else, plus some stock. So it went over 50,000, but in cash wise, it was 50. And I was running the leanest operation you could possibly imagine. It was from my front room, with watches being initially sold on eBay in order to generate cash flow. And unlike many of my friends who had started companies, I wasn't obsessed with scale. I was obsessed with creating a really solid business model and pivoting until I felt like it hit the right notes, and also profitability. I didn't want to just kind of like run it until some kind of infinite point in the future where suddenly it was like, okay, now we can be profitable kind of thing. It was a very traditional business. It's a very traditional business. It was just done in a slightly different way. And so that 50,000 was really all we needed to kind of get the ball rolling. Voila.
Right, 50,000 though, it doesn't buy you a lot of stock, especially the kind of stock that you kind of sell now, right? So if we take away, oh, it did then, did it? Oh, right. Okay. Well, so it's you responsible for putting up the price.
Not the sort of stock that we sell today, but back then it was, £2,000 or £3,000 vintage Cartiers that you could get for £2,000 or £3,000. It was very simple stuff. It was nothing compared to what we sell today. It was very humble and modest.
One of the key people that you mentioned was David Sitwell, right? So he mentored you for a year. What were some of the key lessons that you took away from that?
Good question. So David was the watch collector that I mentioned, and he had a very good understanding of several things. He understood the mentality of fellow watch collectors, I think, and he kind of plugged me into the idea that it's not really, certainly at the time, it was nothing to do with money. You weren't going to make money on watches in those days, especially if you were collecting, for example, independents. So it was the passion, it was the enthusiasm, it was about the excitement of meeting up and saying, "Oh, what have you got?" And then someone will raise their sleeve, and there'll be a debitune under there. But he also just kind of, he was a self-made man as well. He told me when he'd started his company 30 years before, I'm sure he'd be happy to me to say, he basically he had no money to start with. And so he just got a bunch of credit cards, got as much as he could on his credit cards. And that's how he started his company. And then he had he had the biggest travel related advertising agency in the country within like 5, 6, 7 years. And so I think what he said to me was, you're quite cautious. Your dad is very cautious. I'm, cut from a different cloth because I'm a kind of like, a dyed-in-the-wool entrepreneur. I'm comfortable with risk. You need to be comfortable with risk. Don't worry about this. Don't worry about that. Just make sure that you get the fundamentals right and just push forwards. And then everything else you can figure out later. And he was right. We're still correcting for things that we didn't do in the beginning. But if we corrected for those things now, we wouldn't have had the experience that we've had to date. So it was important.
I have a question, Silas, which is how would you say, like in the current day and age, distinguishes a collected man? Because we're seeing such an explosion in the space, right? And like it wasn't like that, like you said, when you started. So after almost 10 years of experience, how do you think, like, what are the key qualities that you think makes us different from them?
Sure. Well, I think you're right. I think there's been a huge explosion, and I think it's a great thing. It's a healthy thing. I think competition keeps you on your toes, and I think that anyone who sits back and complacently kind of just gets frustrated that other people are encroaching on things that they've enjoyed a bit of a kind of monopoly of probably doesn't deserve to kind of continue to enjoy that success. And I always say to my colleagues, it's a good thing when you look in the rearview mirror and there are people catching up, because that pushes you forwards and it tells you that you need to, you need to innovate meaningfully, not superficially. And I think that it's always more of a reflection on you negatively than it is anything else. If other people are catching up, it means that you've slowed down. And so, we've always had a very healthy internal kind of dynamic, I think, between us in terms of constantly reevaluating what we do badly, what we do well, what we need to improve on, what long-term things we need to invest in. And I think that keeps us on our toes. And, I think that some people have said to me a few times privately over drinks when I've kind of said, well, what do we stand for? What exactly do we stand for? The problem is we do lots of things and we're passionate about lots of things, and, we're good at what we do. I don't doubt that for a second. I'm very proud of what we do. But at the same time, it's not always easy to put a finger on it. And the thing that seems to come back again and again is this idea of, in some form or fashion, quality being at the center of our DNA. So whether it's the things that we sell, whether it's the interactions that we have, whether it's the way we try to present ourselves, whether it's trying to kind of focus, not always successfully, but genuinely on continuously improving the experience that our clients have, being sincere in developing relationships so it doesn't just feel like a transaction, which Watch Exchange, certainly did. I think just always trying to kind of improve on what you do well, never taking it for granted that your clients today will be your clients tomorrow, and understanding that anytime I feel like we've just about like getting on top of things, there are always 10 new things that come along that either excite me or excite my colleagues that we should be doing, or a problem that we need to fix. And so I always say to people, it's like building a house where you're like, you've got the ground floor and now you're on the next floor, or maybe the next floor, but part of your ground floor is on fire. And so you're simultaneously having to put out fires, which is fixing historical issues to do with growth, overly rapid growth at times, while simultaneously building the next floor that, will take you to the next level. But I would say that I've never been more excited ever than I am right now about what we're doing and where the market's going and what's to come.
I have a follow-up question. Dan, do you want to go first?
No, please.
Well, okay. So I just thought about what you said earlier, right, Silas, which is, when you first started it, you weren't so worried as much as scaling. And not to, name any names, but there are some major watch platforms that, have started early on and with also like a very discerning demographic, right? Focusing on vintage or, or independence or whatever, but like a specific category of watches that targets a specific category of people. But then obviously as the market grew and more people got interested, certain platforms kind of switched on to being more transactional. And now looking at it, it kind of, well, I'm obviously like speaking subjectively, right? It's lost that sense of touch, but obviously it's very successful. And I was just wondering, right? Like, and you said it yourself, I mean, we all know that Eclectic Man is doing very well, and the pieces that you choose to curate again is very discerning, and I think speaks not to the masses, but you don't need to speak to the masses in this case. You need to focus on quality, and if the people get it, they get it, right? However, now as more and more people get into independence and the market again is growing very rapidly, are you looking at scaling at all, or like how are you looking at it right now? Because is it tempting to do that, or that's my question.
It's a good question. It's a very fair question. I think for a long time we weren't. We were focused on proving the model and then above everything else, investing in the brand, because I think in this space, so much of the value, trust, the qualitative aesthetic, the kind of interaction you have all goes down to the brand. And I've never wanted ever, I mean, you touched upon it briefly. I've never wanted to build a brand around myself. I think that if you build a brand around individual personality, that gives you a short-term advantage, maybe even a medium-term advantage. But in the long term, it's highly disadvantageous. So from day one, I was never looking, this was never a vanity project. I may be vain, but it was never a vanity project. And I also knew, we had offers at the beginning to go into grey market. We were offered millions of pounds to start a grey market business when, grey market was kind of taking off. And I've always been clear in my mind, other than the inexorable progress of digitalization, globalization, it was always crystal clear to me that this market, the pre-owned market, would eventually just get to a point of legitimization that we haven't reached yet, because there's still reticence amongst the major brands, but there's just an absolute inevitability to the total legitimization of this space, so much so that it sits alongside what the big brands will do. And by that, I mean Patek Philippe. I don't just mean everybody else. So whether it's now or in 10 years, at some point, Patek Philippe will sell pre-owned watches. Maybe it's 15 years from now, or they'll collaborate with, partners in a very public way. It's just a question of when, not if. And so I never wanted to be in the grey market, because frankly, it just seems like another kind of very short-term game. Yes, there's plenty of money to be made, but in terms of your brand, in terms of your legitimacy, in terms of the eventual position you want to have in the market, it strikes me as very short-sighted. And so that was something we avoided. To answer your question about scaling, for a long time, we kind of thought of ourselves as a sort of hedge fund type thing, not in a trading mentality necessarily, although there was elements of that, but just in the idea that we could do a lot with very few. I've always preferred to have a very small team of highly capable people that I trust and that I invest in, than have a big team. We had competitors who were turning over the same or less than us with 40, 50 people. Until about 12 months ago, we were basically 5 or 6, but I think we'll be 20 by the end of this year. We moved to a bigger office in London. We've massively invested left, right, and center entirely off our own balance sheet. We are, there's clearly a huge amount of opportunity, and we don't have to, necessarily dramatically change our model in terms of the number of watches we list to be able to dramatically grow our business. And I think it was just one of those things where, had COVID and Brexit not happened relatively concurrently, maybe we would have done this a little bit sooner, but also probably wouldn't have realized just how much opportunity there was, because COVID very much catalyzed our way of doing things. It was very, very beneficial to our business model.
For sure.
So yeah, we will. That's the answer, but in the right way.
Looking forward to it. Yeah, for sure.
Right. One of the key differentiators on your platform to me is the level of photography at a time where Instagram was relatively already mature. Everybody was using it as an advertising channel for watches. But you have a very distinctive look where people say that, and it's become like, yeah, it's the collected man look. And, you know, it's really, I don't know, it flatters the ego when people copy it, right? Was this something you noticed as a gap in the market, or was it by accident?
No, it was by design. So what I didn't say earlier when I was talking about eBay was that I'd always been like, I didn't sell much, like once every couple of months, but I liked using eBay. And I had always been shocked by how lazy people were with their presentation. They would just stick something up, they'd copy and paste someone else's description, and then they'd like make no effort with the photos at all. Whereas I'd found whenever I wanted to sell anything, if I just went to the trouble of taking a few nice photos that were not blurry, that were maybe shot in some kind of lifestyle context, no matter what it was, you know, that looked professional, there was the box and papers. I noticed very early on that made my things sell for more or the same price everyone else's faster. It was just ridiculous. The impact psychologically of presenting something in a clean fashion where you combine clinically presented product photography with attractive lifestyle photography, I think just kind of, it's not that it necessarily sells the product, but it takes barriers away from the decision-making process. And probably it does catalyze the decision. And so that was something that from day one, I absolutely wanted to introduce. And that's, the first person who joined, I was working with one other person at the time who's been with us from the beginning, called Juji. Basically we got an intern photographer who was a barista at a coffee shop, who came up to me on his last day of work, very nervous, absolutely shaking. And he'd seen me over the months with like these giants, whatever, is it A3, the big like double A4 sized sheets of paper, doing like, you know, website maps and like figuring out where things would go. And people had told him, who had spoken to me, that I was starting a watch business. This is 2014, 15. And he came up to me nervously on his very last day and he said, look, I'm leaving, but I love watches and I'm a photographer, 17 or 18, I can't remember. Could I possibly do some work for you or do an internship? And basically within a couple of days, he was with us full time. And I wanted 2 photos a day that were properly shot, or as far as possible, properly shot relative to our means, with this basic DSLR that we bought off Amazon every day. And so we've always done at least 2 high quality creative lifestyle shots for basically 7 years. And it was much easier for people who came before us, and it's been much easier for us relative to people who have come after us. And that's just the nature of the beast. You know, the earlier you join a social media platform and position yourself in a credible way, obviously the easier it is to then kind of grow that. But yeah, it was always important.
Right. And, your watches are launched primarily through Instagram. And it seems to me that the pattern is like 1 watch a day. Is that the best strategy to give that particular watch time to digest in the audience? Because, if you're constantly just putting stuff in, the audience gets fatigued in a way.
I'm not sure. I mean, we've done it forever. That's true. And we have it's certainly got its disadvantages at times, because obviously there'll be multiple people who will try to buy something that's desirable and it'll be gone 30 seconds earlier. And then you have to explain it to them and you have to show them screen grabs, anonymized screen grabs with timestamps. You'd be surprised how often that happens. We intend to increase the number of watches that we list a day from the near future. And we try and figure out the timing so that it is as close to optimal, so that it's like the end of the day in Southeast Asia, the like mid-morning on the East Coast, not too late on the West Coast, and kind of like, some kind of normality maybe in Western Europe, which ironically is not our market. It's North America and Southeast Asia. Those are the 2 dominant markets today for what we sell. But we haven't got it.
I know it's not China, because it works out to be close to midnight in China, Silas.
Well,
I just wanted to put that in
we-
there. You knew that, and you left that out. Like you said,
No, well,
this time zone, it's but you didn't say China, did you?
No, well, it's it's tricky. We're definitely up. To be completely frank with you, we're having a lot of conversations around that right now, and we're trying to figure out what the way of optimizing that is. And I suspect that we will make good progress in the next 6 months. But I would say just bear with me.
Okay.
So I have a question about, do you source the watches first based on demand and what people are asking for? Or do you just, receive whatever you get and then just curate and then decide what gets put up?
So we don't. I mean, I know that wasn't your question, but like it probably helps to kind of say this to kind of lead to it. We don't source. So we've never sourced watches for clients because at any level, because we always say to them, it's very counterproductive. If you want me to go out and find you something, or by me, I mean, if you want the company to go out and find you something, it's just immediately as the buyer on the back foot, the seller has the leverage. It's so much better when you just trust us to find interesting things and then to offer them publicly. And whilst, we have lots of clients now where, let's say a few years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, we would have had a handful of VIP clients. And it was easier to manage their expectations, and it was easier to make sure they got the kind of high touch kind of experience that meant that they always felt like they were in the loop and so forth. It quickly became a situation where there were a sufficient number of those people where you just couldn't. You risk doing more damage to everyone by trying to kind of meet the expectation of a handful than doing the opposite. And so kind of now what we try and do is we just try and make it as absolutely fair as possible. We source exclusively what we like. We turn down the vast majority of things that are offered to us. That's why, we've kept it to one watch a day as opposed to many more at this point. But I feel like that can change now because of the breadth and depth of the market, to be completely frank. But no, we remain very, very, very picky, like super, super picky, super, super curated. And we go after the things that we like. The one thing that we try and do a lot is we try and understand fundamentals always, like fundamentally what makes something interesting. And then we also try and draw parallels between markets. So if one market is very underdeveloped or one brand is underappreciated, we try and draw parallels and say, okay, so actually, if you compare these two things in a vacuum, like they're both incredibly well made, they both have a high degree of finishing, they're both made by very credible names. They were both very important in their era, if we're talking about like neo vintage, let's say. And they both represent something aesthetically that kind of just works today as much as it did when it was released, maybe more than when it was released. And it's like, well, why is that 5 times more expensive? That just doesn't make sense. So yeah, that's the main part of the thinking process, I would say.
And why are those things 5 times more expensive?
Just, I mean, it's fashion, right? It's fashion and trends and what caught the imagination earlier and what got kind of endorsed by sufficient body of people early on. It's just trying to think, it's kind of like the swarm, right? It just and influencers and people of influence equally kind of have that impact. And, that's just, that's the way it is. And, sometimes, to be frank, those prices represent the exceptional quality of that watchmaking, and those price disparities are not just anomalies; they're absolute. They make complete sense. So you do have to also be aware of that. You have to think about it from that perspective as well. Fundamentals.
Okay, I have the next question here, but then I'm going to break it down into 2 smaller questions. I'll ask the first one first, which is, you mentioned that a collective man's really picky when it comes to curating what you offer. So is it like a collective thing that the team decides, oh, this is what we like this, we think there's immense value here? How do you pick out the crops that you want to list?
So I'm very lucky. I have a number of colleagues that I have immense trust in, that over the years, we've kind of grown to know each other very well. We know what we like. We share instinctive appreciations for different things, but we also talk 3-4 times a day about it. Something comes in and we have a chinwag for 10 minutes about why we like it, or like why we think this is ridiculous, or isn't this like disconnected. And I think what happens is, as you do this longer, and it'll be 8 years for us if it isn't already quite soon, as you do this longer, you just start to see patterns, and you recognize that, like, a lot for me started with Roger Dubuis. Like, I'll be honest, early Roger Dubuis was probably one of the most important learning curves for me personally, because the first early Roger Dubuis was brought in by, a very good client, a very like smart guy, I think originally from Shanghai, actually, based in London. And
Sounds like me.
Yeah,
like me.
and I did.
I'm just from outside London, based in Shanghai, and pretty smart.
Well, there we go. We ticked all the boxes.
Yeah, Silas, I love your thinly veiled compliments.
There we go. But he brought in a Roger Dubuis homage chronograph, and I'd never seen one before. And I just kind of, I sat down and he explained the story, the bass movement and the design, and kind of going into that after he left and like figuring it out and deciding what it was worth. Shocking. Like, it just felt absurd how undervalued it was relative to the fact that basically Roger Dubuis is a watchmaker, albeit very inspired by Patek, and therefore like at the time probably seen as a, let's say, as a homage maker, as the name that the watch suggested, as opposed to maybe like a watchmaker in his own right, or sorry, as opposed to kind of creating a new brand with a completely different design in his own right. So, Roger Dubuis basically spared no expense whatsoever when it came to case making, crown choice, pushers, Tascitani pushers, clasp, the boxes, the paperwork, the movements, the Lemania bass movements, the dials. Honestly, it's insane when you go back and you think, how could a watch that had that much qualitative value be worth £15,000 as it was back then? Like, it just boggled the mind, and no one thought it should be worth more. And it was just kind of like starting with that process, and then kind of eventually kind of growing into other things, looking at Daniel Roth, looking at other kind of neo-vintage names from the bigger brands like Vacheron Constantin, just kind of like seeing all these parallels and being like, what the hell is going on here? How does it make any sense that these watches that have fantastic design, fantastic quality, intrinsically represent something of very significant value, early Breguet, 3970 Pateks, all these things, why are they undervalued by the market? It doesn't make sense. And so, you then kind of like apply that same principle going forwards. And in my eyes today, you look at early Parmigiani, and it's exactly the same thing. And it's just like, unfortunately, there will come a point soon where there won't be anything left to discover. And that's fine. That's fine, because there's new stuff coming in, new watchmakers, independent watchmaking is booming. But I can't for the life of me remember your question. So it's a bit awkward. Apologies.
No. It's no. You've answered it. That was my first part of the question. The second part is, I think we'll go into it later on, but since we're on this topic, I just want to quickly ask, how do you pick your watches? Because you're really private, like you don't really post a lot, but then from what I have seen, it's you pick, you buy for life almost, it's very thoughtful. You can see kind of the trace mark, but you don't follow the hype, which a lot of people do. So why did you make that face to you? I mean, I don't know.
Because I know what he wants to say. He wants to say, I don't follow the hype, I set the hype. That's what he wants to say.
That quote will be in my my Instagram bio next week, Daniel.
No. When we post this episode, you better write that on your.
We can put that in as the title. Silas Walton. I set the hype, not follow hype.
Yeah.
But on your collection, I love the VC, by the way. Like that VC perpetual calendar. Oh God.
Me too. Yeah, me too. And the answer is, I made a lot of mistakes mistakes when I started, and it took me a long time, like all things. I think the same is true with anything, even clothes and furniture and other things that you surround yourself with. You make a lot of mistakes in the beginning because you rush in and you're like, oh, I think I love this, and it's a spontaneous decision, and it takes you 6 months to realize, actually, it's great, but I don't really love it as much as I thought I did. And I kind of made a very, very conscious decision a few years ago that I was going to be pretty ruthless in weeding out anything that didn't speak to me as much, and even things that I love. Even things that I love, I absolutely love. That I can't wear. I'll be completely transparent with you. I rarely sell my pieces through the company. In fact, I rarely sell pieces at all. But I recently sold my 15202 BC for a collected man a few weeks ago. I love that watch. I love it. But I bought it spontaneously at the top of the market during the summer because I saw one was available in London, and I love the combination of that dial and case. But it was just too much for me. It was too recognizable. It was too heavy on the wrist with a solid white gold case and bracelet. It was very scratchable. I'd had an A series Royal Oak years before that I loved, and I thought this will match that. And I kind of just realized fine, years ago. And unfortunately I don't have it anymore, but I realized that actually probably that's what I want. I want to go back to basics. And I absolutely, I was so kind of like torn deciding to sell that watch, but I just realized, what is the point of having something however beautiful in the collection that just sits in the safe? I just can't wear it. So I sold it. But what I have done, I have a daily beater that during lockdown I wore more often than not when I was at home, which is just a classic Daytona. It's the least me watch, but at the same time, it's probably the watch that I wore the most during COVID, because it was just I didn't have to think about it. I never think about it. I don't care what happens to it. I don't care about knocking it. I'm never worried about anything happening to it. It feels good on the wrist. I catch it, it tells the time. So on the one hand, I have watches that kind of represent a practical truth, which is kind of just great everyday no-brainers that I like. Then I have watches that absolutely are in the spectrum I'll never sell. The Smith being the prime example. I commissioned that 4.5 years ago from Roger. I was saying to someone yesterday, I literally remember what that moment was like. I was in a basement meeting room of a hotel in Chinatown in New York, and
sounds a bit dodgy.
No, I mean it was a really nice hotel. It was a really nice hotel. But I remember I was but I can't remember what it's called. But I was in this hotel, and I just met someone, and I've been umming and ahhing about writing to Roger and seeing if I could convince him to make a watch for me, because we'd known each other for 3-4 years by then. We knew each other well. But I knew that financially that would have been quite a commitment for future Silas, But I recognized as well that if I didn't bet on myself, and if I didn't make that decision then, it would just be much harder to get one later, and they'd be more expensive, and I would have to wait. So if I waited until the point where I could comfortably afford it, let's say, and I didn't have to worry about it, and didn't put a little bit of pressure on me, I knew that by that point it might not, I'd have to wait longer, and it'd be more expensive, and I wouldn't have that thing to enjoy maybe at an important part of my life. And commissioning that watch was a hugely important milestone in my life, I think, as a collector, because it represented a relationship that has just been so important to me over the years. And Roger was infinitely patient with me. Caroline and Roger were infinitely patient with me. I had like very specific things that I wanted. He did the titanium out of chapter, which he's never done before. He's never used titanium in a dial. He did white ink filled numerals as opposed to blue or gray, black, which he's never done before, and he really didn't want to do initially. But he was strong-armed into it, shanghaied into it, to use a pun, and he agreed. But sorry, and then he used untreated white gold, and it was 38 millimeters, and it just kind of like it was something to look forward to. So at that end, there are those watches, and then in the middle, there are just these watches that I love. That I have no idea if one day I'll sell them, but I can't see that happening. Like at this point, it's just I love my steel Daniel Tourbillon. I absolutely love wearing that watch. I love my platinum skeletonized VC Perpetual that you referenced, the blue subdials. I just think that that's insanely good watchmaking. Trying to think. Yeah, and then there's other stuff in the middle, but it's just kind of I just want to build a collection that gets better and that's as tight as possible. You know, I really want something as tight as possible.
I wholly agree with like refining, you know, your collection, and like, you know, if they don't get worn, then you feel like someone else could possibly do much better. So in light of that, you know, if you're not really wearing the Heppy, you know, I'm happy to take it off your hands, Silas.
Yeah,
so you didn't mention that at all in any of your things. So obviously it doesn't have a high regard in your mind, and it's not like you often post it. So just give me a call after this podcast and I'll be happy to take it off your hands.
No worries. I'll sort you out, Daniel. It's I've that poor Heppy has been referenced so many times. It's been featured so many times in different places that I almost feel sorry for it, because it's probably visually worn down. But no, I mean, like the Heppy was probably the first really significant watch, as in like meaningfully emotionally significant watch that I added to my collection, because obviously, you know, I've known Heppy and I are the same age, we're 34. I've known him for 4 years. You know, Heppy and I knew each other when things were very different, very, very different for both of us. And we forged a strong relationship and friendship at a time when, you know, people weren't coming up to Heppy and asking for a selfie, you know, etc. And I think that when you form that kind of relationship early on, it means a huge amount to you, like I have with Roger. And I think that, you know, Heppy's watches will be watches that I just, you know, forever continue to kind of
there's a
add to my
friendship
collection.
there, right? Yeah.
There's a deep friendship. Like, we really massively enjoy each other's company, and, you know, I'm very, very close to his partner and his daughter. I mean, as in kind of, you know, we all know each other very well. Yeah, you know, we would be friends if there was no business like that. And I think that's always the test of things. You know, we would definitely be friends even if there was no business.
I massively enjoy your friendship too. And
well,
I'm very good friends with Rob. That's what I
there you go.
Say, so.
There you go. Well, no, I know Rob appreciates it too.
I have a question about discounts. So would it be wise for people to ask for discounts, not just from your site, but in general? And if you do give discounts, how do you decide how much to give?
So as a rule, we don't. We never have. But that's an overly kind of like opaque thing to say. Basically, from the very, very beginning, at the very, very beginning, 7 years ago, it was like overwhelming understanding that basically discounting was part of pricing. And I came from a background where I was like, you have cost-based pricing and you have market-based pricing, and like, where do you sit between the two? And I absolutely like refused to factor in any kind of discount into our pricing, because that would inflate our prices relative to the market. And I wanted us to be, you know, very carefully positioned so that we were always kind of just underneath the optimum line, let's say. So, you know, today, if you were to take a sample of all of our clients over the last, let's say, 3 years, you would see that I think the vast majority, probably as high as 95%, either got no discount or like only something a little bit tokenistic as a gesture, because the reality is that we try and choose things that we think people want. We built a platform where they know to come to us, and they know that we sell them well and quickly, and that our pricing is not based on just a finger in the air or just trying to gouge as much value as we possibly can out of the consumer. So I was on the phone to someone yesterday saying, why did you sell that Duphorograph so cheaply? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, I paid, you know, $40,000-$50,000 more for one a year ago. And I said, well, at auction 2 months ago, one sold for X. We bought it, and we put what we thought was an appropriate margin on top relative to what it is. But like in the eyes of that client, that should have been almost 100% more kind of thing. And you know, you don't always get it right. Sometimes you leave a lot of money on the table, and that's fine. We're not, you know, you can't do what we do without being as consistent as possible and as fair as possible, because we operate in a very public way, very transparent way. People upset would just share immediately on the forums or on social media that they're upset. They would screen grab things. They would say, so-and-so has done this. You know, that's a reality, and it's a double-edged sword. It's great and it's terrible. But my obsession for as long as I can remember, and I'm not suggesting we've hit it right every time, we've made our fair share of mistakes, but my obsession from day one, absolutely day one, was I wanted to minimize as far as possible the chances of upsetting people for things that we could control that were to do with objective fairness. And so we've tried to be consistent. So, you know, we've never had a sale. We've never had a sale for accessories. You know, that was a conscious decision, because we feel like by doing so, we devalue the inherent worth of the products that we're selling and offering. And if we believe in them, why would we have a sale? And so it's just kind of, you know, it's, you know, once in a blue moon, we'll get something wrong, you know, and we'll either offer a price reduction as a gesture, or we'll recognize that maybe the market's moved on, and you have to adjust accordingly. You don't want to just sit there with pieces that aren't selling, but you know, it's very much the exception rather than the rule.
My question is like on top of that, and you kind of did answer it, because the original question was, a lot of your watchers fly off Instagram immediately. You know, I think there was a phase I got a bit flippant, because obviously you can tell from this podcast, it's in my personality. And I would like leave a comment, you'd say available now, and I would say now sold, right? Like I was with very like unbelieving, untrusting that these things were even available to be bought, because the next thing is like it's sold so quickly. But it was, you know, about pricing. How do you balance something that is going off so quickly, right? But thinking, do you know what? Like 5 people just asked for that, and I could actually might have been able to push it up a little bit more and increase my profit margin. So you did kind of touch on that already. But what factors do you like reference to get market price? You mentioned auction, but how do you work that, especially now with the market rapidly just keep going up and up and up, up and up, right?
Yeah, so 3 different things there, I think. The first is like in terms of determining why we don't add, you know, extra. We get clients relatively frequently, not that frequently, but maybe once every month. Someone will say something is sold and they'll offer 20% more. And of course, this never gets discussed. Absolutely never. You know, no one we would never, ever like share these things, whatever. But we'll get clients on big, very big watches who will say, oh, I'll pay 15, 20% more, just sell it to me. And we never do it. Absolutely never. The person who commits first gets the watch. And if it's pre-sold, which occasionally used to happen in the past, you know, there's a reference to that in the description. But in terms of, and the reason for that is simple. It's just like brand equity and longevity. If we're going to be doing this for as long as I hope that we're going to be doing it in the future, the only thing that matters is trust. And we can't help the fact that these things go up quickly. Instagram has always been, until there's a better option, always been the fairest way of kind of simultaneously alerting everyone to the existence of a piece. And so it's kind of like, it's an imperfect medium to communicate that to as many people as possible simultaneously and to be as fair. And we have clients who joined Instagram exclusively to track our things, you know, and these people are absolute captains of industry, you know, with, you know, absurd amounts of money to spend on watches that for them, £1 million or £500,000 is just, you know, an instant decision. But for, you know, we treat those people just the same way as we treat people who are joining the hobby recently, and, you know, maybe £30,000 or £50,000 is a really significant purchasing decision. And we try and maintain that consistency, and sometimes we get it wrong, but we try and do that as far as possible. In terms of pricing, it's just everything, you know. So we'll have private data, we'll have private transaction history that we're aware of because there's word of mouth. We're not on, certainly I'm not, and to my knowledge, none of my colleagues are on any of those dealer chats. We've always kept ourselves a little bit remote, possibly a little bit elusive, and, you know, that's maybe sometimes come across the wrong way as a little bit kind of arrogant, but we've always tried to kind of we don't sell to dealers. Sometimes someone will buy something and it turns out that a dealer, but 99% of the time, certainly never consciously. So we price based on what we think something is worth intrinsically, what we think its optimal price is in the market at that moment. We look at auction data, definitely, but auction data can sometimes be quite misleading as well. We look at private transaction data that we accumulate and catalog. We look at public listings for things, and we also keep screen grabs of conversations where things have been offered to us in the recent past in order to benchmark. And so we just try and we do it as far as possible with an eye to what we think it's worth, but also what we think the market will tolerate within reason. And we aim for liquidity. We always, we're in the business of selling watches, and fundamentally we have to turn over our inventory to grow, and we have to keep things interesting and keep things fresh in order to capture people's attention. So it's not our interest to just try and put a 30% or a 40% margin on something, knowing that might then result in it sitting there for 6 months. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
So it goes really nicely onto my next question, which is what do you think of a model? You're a bit scared of my questions, aren't you, Silas?
Whatever gives you that impression, Daniel.
What do you think of a model like Loop This, where they're still announced, people still have a fair opportunity to go for, you get the best price, and it solves the time difference issue?
Excellent.
Okay, that's very telling that you said that and you didn't carry on, right?
I have a lot of time for Eric Koo and Justin, and I think that they're two very smart operators. And I think that the inevitability of this world is that, look, if it's a globalized world, apologies. If it's a globalized market where there are consumers everywhere now for these types of products, waking up in different time zones, if in today's age, everyone is able to kind of interact on social media to some degree, or to kind of, go on a website from, their home desk, whether it's in Shanghai or whether it's in Palo Alto, whether it's in dusty London. And logistics and courier services these days mean that basically you can ship anything anywhere. Why would you not essentially move to a model that doesn't require people to be geographically present in a single location at a specific time, that yes, has its theater to it? Of course it has its theater. But if you're looking for that kind of in-person excitement, go to Las Vegas and take a spin on the roulette table. You can get that high elsewhere. There are lots of other ways. I love the theater of auction. I love in-person bidding. I go every year to the big ones. That will never change. But I think that they've understood quite correctly that today, especially where there's just so much more information and consumers are so much more sophisticated and so much more assertive in sharing their views about things, and things like, the Shanghai Watch Club are there and kind of have created mediums of exchange between like-minded people that have essentially created, they've redistributed the balance of power from perhaps the more conventional mediums of 10 years ago, which would have been forum exchange or individual auction houses or brands trying to dictate what the narrative is. Suddenly, groups of like-minded people are saying, well, actually, we have our own identity. X or Y doesn't necessarily strictly represent our interests or how we feel. And we have our own voice that we want to express. And in a world where that exists, I think it makes sense that auctions are increasingly online, because it just means that everyone has a fairer chance of participating in the process. As you say, it's more transparent, and the market is much more mature than it was a few years ago, a lot more mature. And my final point is, I don't think that the major auction houses do this, or certainly not one or two, but you can't rest on your laurels, right? It goes back to my point an hour ago, which is, if you look in the back, in the rearview mirror, and you can see people coming for you, you shouldn't be angry that they're coming for you or copying things that you probably copied from someone else when you started. We didn't invent lifestyle photography. for watches. Hodinkee did. We didn't invent lifestyle e-commerce. Mr. Porter did. We didn't invent selling watches on the internet. Watchfinder did. But what we did was we understood the things that we thought were important, that were value enhancing. We pulled them together, a bit like Apple. I always piss off my friends, forgive my French, from, I always say, well, actually, I believe in that model. You take the best elements that you find in different places and you bring them together and you try and enhance the whole, and then you try and add value on top, and you move that whole process forward, and you raise the bar if you can for the markets. And if people catch up and do so, it's good for the market. So I think Loop This is definitely a force for good.
Would you ever consider opening a physical store, or say maybe bankroll a up and coming watchmaker that hasn't been discovered yet?
I mean, the latter certainly, the former very unlikely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just because it just kind of like, if you the whole curated aspect and the fact that we haven't done more very deliberately, I think fits with the philosophy that we're not, we love what we do. It's a great business, it's a great market. Don't get me wrong. I'm very, very grateful and very fortunate to be in it. And I'm very excited for the future, but we're not doing this for the money. Like money is fantastic, and business success and all the things that come with it are exciting. But, there were a lot easier ways to make a lot more money a lot quicker had we chosen to do so. But like, if you're doing this because you enjoy it and you genuinely enjoy it when you come into work and it's fun and you like what you do, ultimately, why would you shoot yourself in the foot by kind of taking a shortcut? And so opening a bricks and mortar store for me makes sense if you're a large brand trying to scale up and clearly capture a bit of the market that you're otherwise not hitting. But if you believe in the future of online e-commerce, as much as I do, and that you believe that essentially there will be a replication of the qualitative experience that you have going into Patek Philippe boutique, but through the medium of a website, or as close as it can be, why would you not just continue to invest in that direction and keep going? That's my logic.
Okay. In one of the interviews you did, I read that you mentioned the market. Well, the market aspect of the watch industry kind of drives you more than the actual like watchmaking, right? So I would say you're kind of more logical than creative. So does this affect the kind of people you hire? Are you looking for people who are logical or creative and have an eye for this kind of stuff, for picking watches?
Good idea. Good question. So I will say that basically, when I started this, I did it very much with a business hat on. Unlike everyone was saying to me, "Oh, you're crazy. I can go into this if you're not like passionate about, watch collecting. You're not a watch collector." And and I said, well, the reality is the difference between me and those people is that I won't be emotional about the decision-making process. I will be as objective as possible, and I will focus above everything else on growing all the things that I think are essential to creating a good business, especially in the luxury watch space, which is primarily branding and customer service and then offering. And I will surround myself with the best people I can whenever I find them, sometimes opportunistically and sometimes through the process of headhunting, etc. But I will not grow my team unless I feel like there is a really excellent fit. And so I look for very smart people who are passionate, who are intelligent, who are creative. Absolutely. It's but I have turned into a watch collector. I almost, I caught the disease years after I started this. I'm the accidental watch collector. That's what I am. I ended up like going down the rabbit hole years after I'd kind of been through the through the kind of like grinding experience of being in the business. And I wouldn't change it for a second. I wouldn't do it any other way. I love being in that situation now, but I definitely value creative people, hugely. We've just hired our first full-time creative director, someone who was involved in our website redesign and rebranding and worked with us to build style guides that I knew for years, that I really respected. And that person is joining us, I think, in April. And when I say that we're going from basically 5 to 20, it's because we're just hiring all the best people we can find to fix the things that weren't working and to add value where basically my own taste and those of my close colleagues has kind of reached its limit. or simply we don't have the capacity and the bandwidth to be able to do the things that we had more time for before. I used to personally do the Instagram. For a long time, I personally did the Instagram. For a very long time, I shared it with a colleague. And now I don't do it. But that's only been in the last year and a half because I took it so personally. I was a micromanager in the extreme in that regard, because Instagram for me was the most proximate thing to an interaction you could have on an instant basis with a typical consumer or potential collector. And so I didn't want that to go wrong. And so, but you can't grow a business that way.
No wonder why the
Or a
content's
brand.
much better now, like a year and a half down the line.
Thank you, Dan.
No, but you did touch on, you revamped your website last year, and I thought your website I loved it, with the script and stuff. Not saying I don't like the new one, but it's evidently different. And I thought, oh, why did they do that? Because it was already so strong. Was that a case of not resting on your laurels, or was there more of a long-term decision in that process? Because it
was the longest time that we'd ever gone without redoing our website. Our website at the time was built on code that was 7 years old, and every time we'd rebranded it, the code had just been built on top. And although I'm not an expert in that space whatsoever, it's been explained to me many times that that you get to a point where that's just basically damaging and it's very limiting. And we certainly didn't have updated language in our coding that was going to potentially allow us to do the things that we want to do in the near future. And so basically we desperately needed to rebuild and future-proof. I say to people, when we rebuilt our website, 90% of it was the iceberg. It was 90% of it was below the waterline. When we rebuilt that website, it's because we've created something that now we can modularly add to over the next 5 years. With it is very much a future-proofing exercise. And we spent, I won't say the amounts, but I'll say that we spent, I think, close to 8 times as much as we'd spent the previous time, and we spent more than anyone I know on a new website in order to kind of relative to the platform that we use, which is Shopify. And we did that in order to really allow for continuous evolution and advancement over the next few years. And where before we used to do it iteratively, it would be like, okay, 6 months before we're ready to relaunch, we contact the agency that we've worked with from day one, and we say, okay, we want to relaunch our website. And then you kind of had that slow grinding process. Now we're a constant process of, there's going to be a Mark II and a Mark III, and we've got updates that are rolling out all the time. I think there are updates coming out in a few days' time. There'll be updates coming out in March, April, then updates in June, July. So it just allows us to be a lot more dynamic and flexible. And from a design perspective, what I'll always say to people is, I'm flattered that you felt that way, but I hated it. I was bored with my own, with the website very quickly, and I found the limitations incredibly frustrating to do with the non-automatic adjustment or scalability of images, the kind of limitations on the scripts we could use, the kind of limitations on things that we could build. And I just, definitely a refresh felt like a good thing anyway, just because, why not? But I also, personally really wanted to see change. And like I said, it was a long time coming. And so between future-proofing it for what we're going to be doing over the coming years, and accepting the logic of that, which I had to, and also just building in, we've integrated all these bits of software that haven't come on tap yet, that will just allow us operationally to run a much smoother business. It just needed a rebuild for all those reasons.
Don't worry, I think you got the money required to build it off the sale of the Dufour, Silas. So I wouldn't worry about that too much.
I think we paid for it long before the sale of the Dufour, but I appreciate the point.
Well, I think we've kind of answered the last two kind of questions, right? But I
have one last question though, which is, Silas, now that we spent the better half of an hour or so together, Is it possible for Jacqueline to get onto the Roger Smith waiting list?
Yes.
Yes,
as
there you have it
as
on record.
as much as I would like to suggest that I have access to Roger's personal waiting list, sadly I do not. But I'm sure that Roger and Caroline would be very happy to speak to you about that at some point in the future.
He's gonna think that I asked you to say that for me, which I totally did. No, I didn't. Well, I wanted to say one more thing, which is, and then we'll go into the reverse around. Going off of the website topic. I mean, I think I started following your private Instagram like maybe a year ago, and then it was very clear from the beginning that you're a very visual person. But then when you went that deep into the details of the website and the scripts and limitations and whatever, I didn't realize that you were so visually concentrated and targeted and focused. Again, it's clear from your stories, your point of view in photography, which, I also have a hobby into. It kind of works, right? Watches and photography and lifestyle. And so, I mean, it's great to see what you share. And I think we're all very excited to see the next, 2.0 or 3.0 of the website. So,
thank you.
So we'll go into the reversal round, right, Dan?
Yeah. Okay. Silas, 3 questions, 1 each.
Yeah. I'll start with some slightly softer ones, and I'll finish with a harder one for you, Daniel. If that's all right, just because it only occurred to me this morning. So Jacqueline, I was going to ask you, obviously I get asked this question all the time, but it would be interesting to hear what somebody else thinks from a collector's perspective. What do you feel is undervalued at the moment? Is anything undervalued in today's market even?
The immediate answer that I thought about right now is, I think, and again, this is all subjective, right? So take it with a grain of salt and everything. I think that there's a bubble in the market. Well, I've been thinking about this bubble for like the past year, and it just keeps on getting bigger. So I might not know what I'm saying. In terms of what is undervalued, I'll answer the question first and I'll explain my reasoning. Well, like we were just talking about this, right? Dan and I, we recently each bought a vintage Movado. And I think those are massively undervalued in terms of the quality. I mean, I've never seen mine yet, but I mean, Dan's wearing his right now. And I mean, Dan, what do you have to say about the quality and the build and everything?
Yeah, well, from a design language, which, is a big thing for Silas.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
It's right there. Except,
it's really good. Yeah, I mean, I get that totally.
Yeah. So yeah, you know what? That's the first thing that's off the top of my head because we're just discussing it. But 2 years ago, I would have told you Cartier, but now we know like how the Cartier market has moved. I obviously started collecting in Cartier because they were relatively affordable and there was just such an array of options. Can't say the same now, but and going back to my previous point, I think at this rate, we almost look at it as again, good for the market, but is it really good for the market that the barrier of entry is so dang high now that we can't really feed off? The new blood can't really feed off of it. I don't think it's a good thing, but on the turning side, with the rise of independence, which, you're obviously in your platform is, I would say like one of the leading platforms to show independence off to the world. I think it's a great thing, but it's just from what I've been seeing, following the same kind of footsteps as the bigger brands, which to a collector is kind of sad sometimes when you can't even get your hands on pieces that you really cherish and want to adore. So, I mean, I certainly, with the AP launch recently, do you see what Francois said on the post? I forget his exact quote, but he was like, you know what, we're giving opportunities to non-AP owners because we want to expand our family. I certainly hope that's the case. And I wish that if that is, want to see more of that from, bigger brands, major brands, and also independents. So that's what I'm looking for. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's, am I allowed to come back to that, or?
No, of course,
yeah,
of course.
Yeah.
So I think that's fair. I think that I think there's a lot of responsibility on the shoulder of brands, personally, to kind of navigate those waters and to try and figure out how to perhaps restore the imbalance that is created by the existence of hype watch trends. And I think that ultimately that responsibility falls on their shoulders, because it's one of those things where they love to kind of suggest publicly that they hate it, but in practice, I think that's probably not the case. It's a little bit disingenuous. But I think that ultimately it falls principally on the shoulders of the major brands to find a way to redress that balance. I don't know what the answer is, but I suspect there are a few. I think that like with independence, I think it was just, to be honest, an inevitability. Like I felt this way 6 years ago, 7 years ago. It just didn't make sense that a Roger Smith would sell for 30% less than retail. And when, a Nautilus was selling, whatever it was, 20-30% above retail at the time, now, 100%, 200%. So I think the kind of correction in that regard, especially relative to rarity and the quality of handwork craft, just, for me, makes sense. I'm not shocked by that. I think it's just kind of, again, it would come down to the independent watchmakers to decide how to do that. But it's very tricky for an independent watchmaker, when they often run such tight cash flow businesses, to see so much money left on the table. If they make something, then it's worth 4 times as much on the secondary market. I think that's very tough. So I think that, we'll probably see some kind of correction there as well. I suspect we'll see pricing increasing à la François Bergeron, but not just à la François Bergeron, and other, as other brands are doing in that regard. And that will probably not make things better in terms of accessibility, but it will maybe kind of calm things down a bit. Who knows? I think, but we're also just seeing a booming market. There's so many new entrants into the market. There's so many, when a market is growing, not because a handful of people are manipulating it, which does happen, and which is typically, in my opinion, the kind of warning sign of a bubble, but rather because so many new people are coming into it that just weren't in it before. Independence, a lot of people have come into it in the last 2 years, and for them, it's just a brand new concept. And so they've gone from vintage Rolex or even vintage Patek to suddenly being interested in independence. This is just the natural evolution of the market, I think. But in terms of bubbles, you see them sometimes, and I always think, oh, this is a micro bubble, because I tend not to see big bubbles unless there's it's part of a trend towards what a massive economic market correction. But I think that you do see them every so often. The last one that I really experienced was vintage Hoya. To be honest, since then, I've not really seen anything that really like a bubble, in my opinion. I was involved in that market. I was on the forums every day, monitoring the chat. I was seeing that basically it was 150 people there or thereabouts who were kind of engaging one another and kind of like creating that market. And it didn't necessarily reflect, in my opinion, the broader interest in that space, or the broader market price tolerance. So it's I think actually a lot of things look like bubbles, but I think real bubbles are actually quite rare and only really visible with hindsight. But I agree with you. I agree with you that right now we're seeing a market that we've never seen before. So what do I know? I'm not an economist. Cartier wise, I thought I'd just mention my last acquisition. Actually, my last addition to my collection in December was a platinum Cartier tank asymmetrique from the 90s, and I've not been able to wear it once because I just can't get the right strap for it because of the angles of the lugs, and it's just a nightmare. I had a strap made and it wasn't right. It was far too thick, and I tried to speak to Cartier about it, and I gave them all the information, and they were like, "Oh, that watch doesn't exist." And I said, "Well, what do you mean that watch exists?" "Yes, it does. I've just given you all the information." And I just think that the person I was speaking to, was looking at the new asymmetriques and didn't understand, and it was just like, so I was like, okay, fine, I'll bring it into the boutique, and then we can resolve it. They were lovely.
Come on. I prefer your straps compared to the Cartier straps. If I'm speaking honestly, I am.
It's very kind, but like we just don't make custom
Yeah.
asymmetric stuff. So like I'm a bit screwed in that sense, but I might have something made. But yeah, that's I agree with you, and I actually got that asymmetrique. It was the only one that I really wanted. I love vintage Cartier, you know, like everyone, I would dream of owning a Crash, but actually the one that I think spoke the most to me was the asymmetrique. And so I was really glad that I kind of managed to get one at auction just before Christmas. And yeah, that's the one I'm looking forward to wearing.
I think the asymmetric cloche Crash as well as the Big Noir, although they look all like very drastically different, but it's very clear inherently how strong the creative language is within the design of those four shapes. I mean, not to mention the
100%.
centre and whatever, but you know, we're seeing the reiterations of the really, you know, iconic models within Cartier, right? Like they did the centre last year. But I'm just looking for if they would create something new, you know, that is kind of reminds you of the heydays of that kind of design watchmaking. So if I were to, you know, if anybody from Cartier is listening to this, which you're not, that's what a single person wants to say. Yeah.
Well, they, you know, I think if anyone can, Cartier can.
Yeah, for sure.
So my next question for Long Long is a relatively easy one, but also maybe the opposite. Is there anything specific right now that you feel comfortable talking about that you're chasing as a watch?
I was prepped the question, right? Like,
oh,
sit down
fine,
and
very
send me
good.
the question. Wait, but I was thinking, I was like, oh, that's easy. But then I was like, wait, I can't answer.
What?
No, I know. Because, okay, I have to be honest with you. I think for a long time, at least for the past year, like I'm really put off by the fact that everyone's just talking about prices, the Nautilus, and then everyone's like chasing new releases. For the past month, everyone's just waiting for the AP release. And then you can see everyone's like posting the same thing. And it kind of just it kind of kills it for me, because I like the whole experience of like meeting people, and it's very organic. They're wearing something. You're like, hey, what are you wearing? And then you go and research, and then you think, hey, I feel inspired. I want to get that thing. I've lost that for a long time, and I don't want to just comb through websites and look for something. So obviously I do have my ideal, like a 3940 and like a 5970, all these references that I need, right? But for a long time I haven't actually actively looked, because I'm just hoping for the day I'll bump into someone or I'll talk to someone and be like, hey, I've never seen this before. So yeah, that's my answer.
You've never seen this Movado before?
It's a good answer. Other than this Daytona, I've never bought a watch new in my life. I've never kind of well, actually the Roger Smith, I suppose technically, but I don't mean like from a boutique. So I've never really experienced that that kind of like going in and
you kind of don't need
figure
to
out what's available. No, today you don't. Not today. I don't think you need to anymore. But cool. Well, in that case, Daniel, would you do me a favor and just give me an answer for this journalist? What role do you see watch brands or watches as products having in the metaverse in the future? Do you think that there is a role, and do you think that there's a future in the concept?
Yeah, so your answer to the journalist should be, I don't follow hype, I set hype.
That's very good.
Which, right? And then leave them dumbfounded. No, when you say metaverse, you're talking about the blockchain and internet 3.0. Is that what you're talking about?
I'm talking about particularly people. So to be specific, I'm talking about the digital manifestation of a physical product in a artificially rendered reality.
Okay. Yeah. So I think, first of all, I think papers, right? Don't know how it's going to be done, but if there's so much value attached to papers and the effect on the price of the watch, right? But yet the actual thing, which is papers, is such a flimsy product right now, right? That can be, as you know, they're easily lost, easily misplaced. And provenance is really, really important in watches, especially the area if watches are supposed to go or will be going into the pre-owned market, the provenance is really key. You know, just from a basic point of view on authenticity. You know, if you can trace it all back to manufacture, then your authenticity issues are greatly reduced. So papers are definitely one thing, but then be interesting to see, you know, as watches now transition, you know, with the prices going so high, a lot of people, and not everybody collects like this, but some people definitely just see it as an asset that they park their money in. And that was actually created as a response to brands responding to the gray market, realizing, you know, the independent watch brands seeing that, oh, we have this gray market thing happening right now. Okay, now we can actually use this gray market to make our watches really desirable on the market by increasing the price.
But ironically, also heavily contributing to the existence of the grey market through other means.
Yes. And then, you know, as those prices have now gone so much premium, right? The collectors have now seen, okay, apart from showing off, that it's worth this price, is actually a good way to park my money and invest as something that may continually grow up or go up, right? And then you've got that like investment kind of mentality. Now, then can you make a digital financial product out of that? You know, will somebody be clever enough to make one such as NFT, whereby, you know, my understanding, which is admittedly very limited in this space. I don't play with NFTs, so I have read up on a little bit on it. Where a lot of something
I see you
is marketing, right?
I would have expected you to be part of the Bored Ape Club. I'm revealing like my lack of knowledge, but yeah, sorry, you were saying.
So you know, when a 5004 or particular pieces are very desirable already, right? And you can, you know, make money off it, you're not actually bothered about owning the piece, right? Then I could see that potentially happening as well, right? But I don't see the brands doing it because I just don't see them being the first to think about monetizing that way. They'll lock down the pre-owned first. Someone's going to do that side of and then maybe the brands don't generally like to be the first to do it. They like to see a third party do it. Then they try and move in the space, which is kind of like, you know, Watchfinder doing that, what they did, then getting bought out by like Richemont.
Silas is there busy taking notes. Like, what do I tell them?
Silas is like, this is not helping me at all.
Like, can you just type
I think it's a good answer.
Like, type that up and just send it over.
So I think those two things help brands. And if there was a ledger as well, be really interesting to see who was clipping. Right?
Yeah.
You know.
But do you know NYC Watch Guy? Have you ever looked at his blog?
Yeah, wow.
No.
Yeah, he did a couple of really interesting posts about the potential role of blockchain technology in the watch world. But he also did a follow-up blog post where he basically said, unfortunately, it's never going to happen because the brands are not necessarily going to want to, you know. So one thing that I think is interesting that you guys have said a few times is when you refer to the gray market, I get the impression you're referring to watches that have gone up in value because they've been, you know, they've been bought by dealers who have flipped it, etc. But when I started, and for a long time, for me, the gray market was an extremely dampening force on the market for new watches. I mean, the gray market was the absolute kind of like, it was very bad. Like it wasn't about like the handful of references that were worth more. Like maybe a Nautilus is worth $20,000 more max. It was about, you know, prices being like 50% less because, you know, when the financial collapse happened in 2008, basically lots of watches came out of, to my understanding, from Southeast Asia that basically were no longer sellable, and they eventually migrated all the way to North America. And then they just it took years and years and years and years and years for that supply to kind of correct. And obviously now we've got a booming market, and so people don't remember that. But for me, the gray market was basically something that was heavily fed by the watch industry as a way of clearing their inventory and of recovering capital, but done with a kind of you know, the kind of look to the left while somebody else did something to the right. His argument was that the watch industry will never be fully comfortable with getting rid of that, and therefore they're never going to want full traceability on, how watches entered the supply chain, etc. Another point I think that's very valid is, you talked about proof of ownership and provenance through blockchain technology, and I think that's a really good one. It's just that I think you need brands to really apply it consistently for it to work, and they need to kind of embrace it totally or not at all. It's very binary. It's 0 or 1. And I just don't see right now. It feels like it's more tokenistic than anything, which is a shame. But I'm hopeful that will change in the future. And when you talk about the metaverse, I suppose apparently there are brands that are creating watches specifically for the metaverse. I can't remember, something like Hublot. I'm not sure. Don't quote me. But I know that there are brands that are officially engaging in that space and are now creating digital watches that you can put on your avatars that you can buy, just like you can buy a physical piece of real estate. But I think your point about people who buy watches as alternative assets to invest in, as opposed to watches because they're watches, is probably very true. What's the difference? If you're not buying it to physically own it and you're doing it just an investment, why would you not buy something that costs X amount in the metaverse that you think will be worth 2X in a month's time?
Exactly.
Why would you not buy NFTs of Bored Apes, etc.? So, I think it's those different currents, right? For someone like me, it's perhaps a little bit alien, but for a consumer in their mid-20s, maybe, that kind of has grown up in this world that's just very different, perhaps, to the one that we're familiar with. Maybe for them, there's just an immediate parallel, and they're comfortable investing in digital, things that just don't necessarily make as much sense to us, but to them make perfect sense, especially if that's the way they think the world is going. If we're going to have more lockdowns, if we're going to have more distant engagement, if Zoom calls aren't going to be video conferencing, but each of us will have a Facebook. God, I used to have one. I don't have it anymore. Whatever the device is that you put on and you see the world in virtual reality, then maybe there'll be a place for that in the future, because maybe I'll want to look down at my avatar and see the watch that I'm wearing in real life. I don't know.
I have a thought. What about authenticity? Because I was familiar with StockX at its infancy. I say that as I invested it. I did a case study on the StockX platform, and obviously their platform selling point surrounds authenticity and verification, right? And then before this whole NFT thing blew up, they already were creating digital records of QR codes that come with their product. So if you scan it with your phone, it shows up as a digital record saying that, all the serial numbers and whatever, and that your shoe or your, I don't know, fancy fashion item is authentic. So maybe that could also be a possibility. So goes right with what Daniel suggested with the papers. There could be a digital copy that says something about the authenticity of your timepiece or something.
Yeah, 100%. The only, and I do agree, but the only thing is that in his blog post, he addressed that point, and he said you would have a situation potentially where you could have authentication papers that are NFT, in the form of NFTs that would be separate to the actual product itself, and you could end up someone could end up selling a fraudulent product with the original NFT authentication papers. You would have no idea, and also because essentially there's only meant to be one, the person who then owns the real product is screwed because they're unable at that point to get legitimate authentication. So it's very tricky, but and then you go down a rabbit hole. It's well, maybe brands produce an archive extract for that NFT authentication. They say this is copy 2, and then it's just so it's tricky. It is tricky, but I think whatever you can do to make things better and more transparent, more secure is great. So we'll definitely find this market will definitely continue to evolve in a positive direction, and there will definitely be tangential benefits. I just think that it's probably a little bit tricky to know what those are at this stage.
Okay, right. Well, we go on to the pump push around.
Okay.
So, right, I think Long, you take the first one.
All right. Oh, that's worded really weird.
Okay, ask it in the way you want to ask them.
What gets you excited still?
Oh no, we're skipping that question.
No, skipping
Can we
that
skip
question.
that?
We're skipping
Yeah.
that question.
All right.
That's a bit direct, Long
No.
Long. Jeez.
Like-
What gets himself excited? Jeez. I know it's Friday, you know, but
God,
from
is it
my
Friday?
understanding, Silas is a Sunday man.
Okay,
Yeah.
so one book
Friday morning in
that-
London.
one book that you should read and give a short synopsis of what the book is about.
So I confess that I don't read as many books as I should. And the last book that I read that I really liked, I can't even remember the title, the name of the author, but I can describe it and everyone will be able to shout it at me. It's basically the book that was written about Netflix and the culture at Netflix.
That will never work.
No, it's got a different name. It'll be somewhere. But anyway, it was written by the former or the current one of the two CEOs.
Mark Randolph.
Mark Randolph, I think, and a professional author. They co-wrote it.
Okay.
I think it was Mark Randolph because there were two. There was
Yes.
there were essentially two people who were kind of like at the same time. I'll look it up and send it to you anyway. And basically, it was all about how Netflix approaches created, or how they approach creating their business, and how they fostered a certain kind of mentality internally that led, I think, to a period of great success, not just because of the markets. Obviously, today now we see that their share price is going down because of post-COVID blues. But I thought that book was really fantastic. I thought it, the things that it said about rewarding people, paying them the most that you can, the most that you can afford relative to, paying them basically what they're worth in the market or just above what they're worth, so that they're happy. About holidays, about maybe being more of a sports team, an elite sports team rather than a family, just to kind of like, all those things I thought were very interesting. I wouldn't necessarily adopt all of them or even the majority, but I think fundamentally there was something in that book that I found very refreshingly pertinent to kind of my situation, to our situation, and also I think probably very relevant to a lot of companies. And I just, I read that book cover to cover, and I was sad that it was finished. So I would definitely recommend. The name of the book that I can't remember, by the author whose name I can't remember, but I will send it to you. And it's like
Are you sure it's not called? Are you sure it's not called That Will Never Work?
No, I don't think so. No, it's not that one. It's
Okay.
I'll find it now on the fly, and I will tell you exactly what it's called. Because there are a couple obviously that have been big, but it's not that. It's called, of course, I got aviation mode because I didn't want to. Give me 2 seconds. No Rules by Reed Hastings and Aaron Mayer.
So that's
Reed Hastings.
That's a CEO after. Yeah.
Yeah.
That founded it with him. Yeah.
He's it's a fantastic book. It's a fantastic book. So, but yeah, I'm going to read That Will Never Work now because I can see that that's next. That's obviously the other one that's very relevant. But yeah, Netflix and the culture of reinvention. And I'm a big believer that you have to continuously re-examine fundamentals and reinvent. So it definitely spoke to me.
Right. My question: what did you want to be as a child?
Paleontologist.
Oh, right.
When I was very little. Then I think I wanted to be an astronaut or an astronomer. I can't remember which. Then I wanted to be in the army. And then when I was an adult, I wanted to be a diplomat and then an entrepreneur.
Okay.
One piece of business advice that you can share.
Find fantastic people and surround yourself with them because they make the difference.
Yep.
Your most annoying habit. My questions.
These questions are.
This is unfair.
A tendency to micromanage, I suspect.
Look at your next question, Lala.
So unfair.
Like, why did you give her these questions, Dan? I mean, it is relevant to you. The next question.
Yeah, it is.
It is relevant.
Okay. Well, okay. Can I change my question because I really don't want to ask?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Which is okay. And it's something I'm genuinely curious about, which is when people reach out to you and your team at ACM, we're talking about the investment factor. What percentage would you say people are buying because they're true collectors, and what percentage, like, are they coming in from an investment perspective, or do you think there's like a mix of both in between?
There's definitely a mix, but I would say that it's you never really know. It's such an infinitely small fraction of people who are kind of cards on the table, saying I'm buying this as an investment. You kind of, after a couple of transactions, you get a sense of a pattern, but it's just I think no one really, in the moments where they convince themselves that they want to make a spontaneous decision to part with a lot of money for something that we've just announced, which unfortunately is, obviously, as we touched on at the beginning, the nature of the beast at present, that kind of like almost drop type situation. Very rarely are people making those kinds of decisions purely for financial reasons. Like maybe there's something they've been waiting for and it pops up and we have it and it's priced at a level that makes sense to them and they're ready to jump. But it's very, very rare that you get the impression that someone is making a purely kind of financially led decision. But yeah, it's very rare. But I'm sure it's much more common. It's just that it's very rare to be able to tell.
Can't you tell from the questions that they ask, though?
No, not typically. No, like no, like the questions are pretty much the same questions. And they're conscious that if they delay, somebody else might get the watch. So it's just kind of it tends to focus the mind, I would say, narrows the thinking.
Next.
Right, my question: how do you make your tea? Tea bag, milk, and water. What order, please?
So I boil my kettle, then I put in my tea bag, and I grew up in a household that was religiously. My mother is very much a rules-based person, and she would insist that we set a timer for 3 minutes exactly. Wow. When stewing her tea. She's very big on her tea, and so I kind of I don't do that deliberately as some kind of rebellious gesture, but I just kind of I know how very British. Surely this is like some kind of meme or kind of cliche. Like how does an Englishman? And how does an Englishman rebel? He doesn't time his stewing. And I do that, and then I wait a minute, and then I take the tea bag out, and I add some milk, and I'm good to go. It's as exciting as that.
Okay. So you take the tea bag out before you add the milk.
Yeah, I hate it when people add milk to a tea bag. It's just like, I don't want to see. It's like a floating thing. I don't want my tea bag floating in my milk. It's just like lazy. So, and then I'll add a dash of honey. I'll always add a dash of honey.
It's like so random.
I so don't get it because I don't drink tea like that.
Yeah, please try it.
Do you know what? People judge people in England by that.
Okay. And rightfully so.
Okay.
No, your next question.
What is the best thing to put on toast?
Be careful, because Long's going to take this personally.
So I'm much more of a savory person than a sweet. So when I lived in Paris, I lived in France. I grew up in a French school. I went to a French school till I was 10. I spent all my holidays, as long as I can remember, in France. So I love a bit of pâté or terrine with on a piece of toasted bread with a cornichon sliced up, or I do like goat's cheese sliced thinly with a little bit of honey on the toast between the goat's cheese. I toast the bread and a bit of honey, then I slice up the goat's cheese, sprinkle on some Herbes de Provence, and then I put it under the grill. So those are my two kind of go-to favorites, I would say.
Now you're speaking French. I just remembered, did you do the voiceover for one of your videos of the chronomètre à résonance? Was that you?
No, I didn't. I have a colleague who speaks French as well, and I'm pretty sure he did it.
It sounded very familiar.
His colleague's called Walton Silas.
No.
Why don't you do more videos, though? Why don't you do more videos?
Because they cost a ton, man. Have you seen the kind of production value?
We intend to. We've just built. We've basically moved to this much bigger office, and we've got a basement space that's bigger than our old office, and we put in 2 small studios alongside storage, and we intend to hire a full-time videographer soon to produce video content. It's just my absolute is the word axiom? I'm not sure, like the one unofficial rule that we've had from day one at ACM is there's just no point doing something unless you can do it like really well. And so I'd rather be the last to the party and do it properly than try and like jump on. And we knew we it was absolutely inevitable that we're gonna like go into video properly. It's just that, I'd rather not do it unless we can add value. And other people are doing it very well right now. Look at Ben with his podcast with Ed Sheeran and stuff like that. And it's just, you just got to
Don't worry about
recognize
that. People are going to be saying, like, look at that podcast with the waiting list and Silas Walton.
There we go.
Like, you're doing this because you said, like, you don't want to do it until, you can do it as best as you can. And that's what people are saying already before this is released. Yeah.
There you go.
Right. So, if you could bring back something from the past to the modern day that you think, would benefit us, and we're not talking watches here, what would it be?
Something from the past that benefit us. I'm going to make a balanced political discourse.
What is that?
Balanced political discourse.
Oh, balanced political discourse.
Something a little bit less, a bit less partisanship.
Okay, good answer. I personally think a newspaper. Like, I wish there were more newspapers. Like the idea of having your breakfast, sitting down, like not disturbed, and catching up on and looking for things on the columns. What catches your eye, and being able to focus. I think I would really enjoy that, just that half hour or 15-20 minutes, and you'd be able to then just shove it under your arm and just I really
I mean maybe my answer is maybe I can amend or update my answer. I would bring back Concord. I would definitely bring back Concord. I think that we, for understandable reasons, have thus far like passed and regressed in terms of the golden age of international travel and aviation. And I know that it's like, the kind of the visual person and the kind of like slightly naive person to me that says it, but I think there's something quite sad about having lost the kind of like very obviously experiential aspect of like traveling at the speed of sound or faster than the speed of sound across the Atlantic, for example, in what is essentially an incredibly luxurious experience. It's and actually, like, you just assuming I could never do it, and like assuming that like I wasn't talking as a person who would consume the service, just the idea that we do that and that we push the boundaries of technology and such to a point where we are doing things faster and more efficiently and as glamorously as they can. There's something in me that appeals there, and I just think it's a shame that that we aren't yet, but I think we will soon be doing that in an environmentally intelligent, friendly, and cost efficient way. Because I just think that, like, it's kind of crazy that it takes me whatever it is 6.5 hours to get to the east coast of America, 5 hours on the way back with the Gulf Stream. And then it's like, it's always going to be a drudging experience. And like going to the west coast of America is exhausting. And I just think that it's a shame that we seem to have like gone backwards rather than forwards on that front. And I think the Concorde represented probably the peak of kind of society's confidence in the future and the kind of the promise of the future in aviation.
That's a good answer. I wasn't expecting that. I was going to say, when Dan mentioned newspapers, I thought it'd be cool. I know it's a British thing that they used to print marital news on the newspaper, right? And they don't really do that here. So I thought, maybe that'd be cool. Anyways, okay, last question.
Yes.
Go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, no. My parents did that, and the birth of their children was announced in the Times. My father spent 40 years working in the newspapers. He was on Fleet Street, and he was the managing director or group classified managing director, I can't remember, for Associated Newspapers, and he helped found the Evening Standard, which is a newspaper here, and he ran other publications. And so I grew up in a household where newspapers were, a huge part of my life. But yeah, you're right. It's a shame that we don't like necessarily announce births and deaths and things like that, marriages. It's definitely something that's dying out, sadly.
Yeah, especially in like a small community, right? Benedict Cumberbatch announced his marriage on a newspaper, so that's how I found.
That's nice.
Yeah. Last question: who should we have on the next podcast? You think? Anybody you'd recommend?
I mean, you should have Mark Cho on the podcast.
We did.
We have.
Fine. I take it back then. You've already had him. Someone did the same to us recently. They commented on Instagram on an interview that we recently published. Said, "Why haven't you got Mark Cho?" And I said, "Go back to 2018 to like July, August. He's there." Who else? Alternatively, God, there are so many interesting people. Trying to think who would suit. I mean, have you spoken to Phil Toledano in New York, Mr. Enthusiast?
No, but I have watched his videos.
He'd definitely be up for it, and he's like a fascinating guy. I like Phil a lot. Another Englishman, unfortunately, but nothing's, you can't have everything.
He's really interested in like vintage cars and whatnot, right? He's an artist, right?
Yeah, and very much like 70s Patek, 70s design, 80s Patek. He's very original. Like he's got excellent taste, and he's very original. And I think he's definitely a fun person to talk to. So I would suggest it him.
Right. Just before Jack rounds off this podcast, I just want to say, the biggest compliment I can play to you and your platform is sometimes I look at that platform and I think, if there wasn't Anne Hodinkee, this would be in the perfect position to do it, right? Except you came from a watch transaction, although I know you hate that word, environment, and then going on to content, rather than the other way, which what Hodinkee did. In terms of that profile, the Collected Man is for me, speaks volumes. That's the biggest compliment that I can give your platform. You weren't expecting that, were you, Silas?
I was caught off guard. I wasn't expecting a compliment, full stop. But I'm very grateful and very appreciative, and I have a lot of respect for what Ben's achieved.
Okay. Well, before I end off the podcast, I guess I'll add on to that, which is I'm also very appreciative of the cumulative amount of articles and information that you guys have published. It's certainly a source of knowledge that I often go back to whenever I'm looking at stuff or want to learn about something. So kudos to that, and I hope that you guys continue to do that on top with all the stellar photography. So with that, I mean, Long, do you want to add anything before I round off?
Okay, since you guys all said something nice.
No pressure. Okay. No pressure. Englishmen get very upset.
Yeah. This is unrelated to ACM, and it was completely random, but I was just thinking about this. I am just really grateful that you're not like a douchebag, because I have you're very private. So when I tried to do research on you, there weren't that many interviews. I mean, there were some. So I came in thinking, okay, this is going to be someone that's very rehearsed. It just doesn't really want to share so much about the business, but he knows what he's doing, but then he won't. Yeah. So
won't open up.
Won't open
and give
up.
You
but this is just
PR answers.
Yeah, this is just very organic. It was real, genuine. So I enjoyed it a lot. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to have been asked.
Okay. Yeah.
He says with crossed arms with protected body language.
Okay, guys. We hope that you enjoyed the episode with Silas, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.
Thanks, Silas.
Thank you.
As always, thank you for listening to the Waiting List podcast.
We hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. And if you have any questions,
comments,
or feedback,
feel free to reach out to us at the Waiting List Podcast on Instagram or via our private accounts.
We'll see you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.